Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the virtual lecture, Rhythms of Revolution, a Cold War History of Cuban-Chilean Cultural Exchange and Political Transformation by Kimiko Nicole LeNeave. My name is Jorge Duani. I'm the director of the Cuban Research Institute at Florida International University, which organized today's event. I also want to acknowledge the co-sponsorship by the Kimberly Green Latin American Center and the FIU libraries, especially the Diez Ayala collection. Before continuing, let me remind you that you can submit questions during and after the lecture by using the the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And then I'll compile the questions and pose them to our speaker after her presentation. So I'm very pleased to introduce our guest speaker today, Kimiko Nicole LeNeave, who is a PhD candidate in history at the University of California in San Diego. She also holds a BA in history and Latin American studies from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She has taught several courses in ethnic studies, history, and English at UC San Diego, as well as at the Fusion Academy, also in San Diego. She specializes in Latin American and Caribbean history during the national and colonial periods. She's currently a recipient of the Diez Ayala Library Travel Grant at the FIU Library, and previously she has received other research fellowships and grants at UC San Diego and UNC Chapel Hill. She has conducted archival research in Cuba at several institutions, as well as oral histories in Mexico for the Latino Oral History Archive at UNC Chapel Hill. Her PhD dissertation, Rhythms of Revolution, Socio-Political Intersections of Music in the Cuban Cold War, illuminates the ways that music shaped political cultures and events in Cold War Latin America by examining the exchange between musicians and insurgents, as well as transnational relationships between Cuba and other countries mired in political polarization. As you can appreciate, the topic of today's lecture forms part of her dissertation project. She has also presented her work at various academic conferences at UC San Diego and Berkeley, as well as UNC Chapel Hill. So without further ado, I give you Kimiko Nicole LeNeave.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Dr. Duani, for the introduction. Buenos tardes to everyone in attendance via Zoom. I'm delighted that you could all be here. It's truly a special opportunity that we can actually do this in webinar format now instead of in person, because I know that there's many of you here from places outside of Miami, Florida, where we're currently located. I did want to offer a special thanks to Florida International University and everyone here at the Cuban Research Institute for funding this week's research with the Diez Ayala Library Travel Grant, and truly for being so welcoming. Muchísimas gracias to Verónica González, the archivist and librarian of the Diez Ayala Cuban and Latin American Popular Music Collection, for all of her work with this project. It is always such a joy working together. And also to our kind-hearted work study students for helping me organize the hundreds of materials that we were flying through this week. Thank you to my dissertation committee at the University of California, San Diego for guidance in my research, as well as my undergrad advisors at UNC Chapel Hill for continuing to be mentors even years after I have now graduated. To my dear friends, family, and my partner, thank you for supporting me amidst all the ups and downs that have come with researching stories of the Latin American Cold War, and especially Cuban history amidst a global pandemic and everything that's brought on in the last couple of years. So before we dive into today's talk, I wanted to acknowledge that my research does address a variety of controversial topics, not only within my field, but also the community here in Miami, Florida. For many, the Cuban Revolution of 1959 and the counterculture movements of the 60s and 70s invoke a variety of emotions. So as I proceed today, please know that I do so with the utmost respect for the Cuban and Cuban diaspora communities, and in an effort to share the stories of Latin American musicians who have shaped many around the world, were impacted by the Cold War, and have made a claim in history with their songs. So my dissertation, Rhythms of Revolution, as was mentioned, is a social cultural history of Latin American radical cultural politics as experienced through music from the moment of the 1959 Cuban Revolution until the defeat of revolutionary left horizons in the 1980s. I investigate how Cuba contributed to an anti-imperialist leftist cultural sphere throughout the Americas, using music as a tool to export revolution. I seek to understand the impact and significance of Latin America's song movements by highlighting the ways transnational networks of musicians and insurgents develop. By uniting Cuba and its hemispheric neighbors, I explore the extent to which el Movimiento de Nueva Trova, the new Trova movement, and Nueva Canción Chilena, the Chilean new song, animated the politics and of the socialist left during Latin America's Cold War. Expanding upon Cold War histories and Latin American music studies, this dissertation is exploring the vitality of the Chilean-Cuban connection, making interventions in music history and studies of cultural politics of the transnational left. I have set 3 fundamental goals for my Rhythms of Revolution project, and I wanted to provide a brief overview of those so that you have a bit of background of where this project is being built from. So first, it is to share stories of the musical political relationship between Cuba and Chile. Second, to document the production and the dissemination of these musics. So looking from these moments of recording studios to song festivals to radio and film, and even now to streaming platforms. So some of the music that we'll take a look at today, you can actually access via Apple Music and Spotify from your home. And third, to illuminate music's role in processes of memory making to help us better understand the function, not only the meaning of these song movements of Nueva Trova and Nueva Canción, even as the Cold War has officially come to an end. So while Rhythms of Revolution is a history dissertation at its core, I do have formal academic training in ethnomusicology, musicology, sound studies, cultural studies, as well as history, literature, and anthropology. And this background at my time at the University of North Carolina, as well as University of California, has truly equipped me with these research skills necessary to produce an interdisciplinary project that remains centered around the archive. The archive remains fundamental in my historical research, but it does not offer a complete picture of the historical events being studied. And so in order to revitalize how we consider cultural history, this interdisciplinary approach offers vital tools for filling the gaps in archival documentation, grounding musical sources and interviews in the discipline of history. This approach also allows me to ask some new questions about the creation and the value of politicized creative expression in these moments of very violent transformation. And so over the years, from my moment as a freshman at Carolina, taking some music classes, to now over a decade later, trying to make sense of these things, there are a few questions that have continued to come to mind. So how did musicians and actors collaborate in the dissemination of political ideology and the commemoration of revolutionary subjectivity? How does a focus on militant music enrich our understanding of Chile and Cuba's relationship during the Cold War, which has largely been understood through foreign diplomatic exchanges? To what extent did Cuba and Chile unite in the formation of revolutionary and leftist protest cultures? What was the wider role of Cuba and Chile's relationship in the Americas Cold War, and how did this relationship shape Cold War events? And finally, what is the role of music in processes of memory making, especially when we have these kind of competing narratives of grassroots recollection versus a national or official narrative of the past? So as mentioned a moment ago, while seeking to answer these foundational research questions, I am integrating music and interviews as sources. And for this reason, the Díaz Ayala collection here at Florida International University has been a truly invaluable source of recorded music, newspapers, interviews, films that are housed very conveniently here in the United States. Travel between Cuba and the US has been difficult, if not impossible, as an American for over 60 years. And then in the last 2 years, COVID-19 has compounded some of these issues, presenting new challenges apart from those that existed due to political tensions between the nations. The Díaz Ayala collection has not only allowed me to move forward with my research while stateside, but has actually provided critical primary and secondary source materials that I could not have accessed on the island. For those of you here today that might be less familiar with the Díaz Ayala collection, It has over 150,000 items, so LPs, 78s, cassettes, sheet music, books, films. So truly a dream for a music lover and historian like myself. It's air conditioned, so for those of you that perhaps have done research in Cuba, this is also truly a gem. Furthermore, as a collection of not only Cuban but Latin American music, the archive has really illuminated and helped me to confirm the countless transnational networks that music generated during the Cold War period throughout the Western Hemisphere and the world. And so being able to see all of these side by side has allowed this research to move forward in ways that it otherwise would not have been able to. So although I cannot answer all my dissertation's research questions here in our time today, be on the lookout for hopefully a future book after this dissertation is complete. But I will be taking us through the story of the Cuban and Chilean connection during the Cold War using 3 case studies of these transnational dialogues and interactions to shed light on the importance of musicians in leftist politics in Cuba and Chile in the 60s through the 1980s. So to provide a little bit of background, to situate these case studies, I wanted to kind of set the scene of what the world was looking like back all the way into the 1940s. So in the 40s, artists of an American folk music revival here in the United States began to unearth earlier music styles to create a new folk-inspired genre. And as Cold War pressures mounted throughout the 1950s, these folk songs and lyrics became increasingly political in time. By the 1960s, as the revival movement began to reach its peak here in the United States, musicians who you probably have heard their names, Woody Guthrie, Pete Seeger, Bob Dylan, to name a few, began to embrace the progressive sentiments of the decade, writing left-leaning notions of protest into their song lyrics. Latin America was not absent from this Pan-American folk music revival and its left turn. In the 1960s, several countries, including Argentina, Chile, and Uruguay, saw the emergence of roots revivals of their own that also began to seek socio-political change. Rapidly gaining popularity, Latin America's blossoming song movements became associated with the region's revolutions, the New Left and liberation theology, and even the hippie movements of the decade. Nueva Canción Chilena was a movement with humble beginnings. Violeta Parra, one of the foundational figures of Nueva Canción Chilena, spent the 1950s gathering thousands of songs from the Chilean countryside to release her book Cantos Folclóricos Chilenos, Chilean folk songs. In time, Nueva Canción would grow into one of the most popular movements across the continent. And inspired by these folk music revivals and even creating one of their own, young Cuban musicians such as Silvio Rodriguez, Pablo Milanés, Santiago Feliu, Vicente Feliu, Noel Nicola, Carlos Puebla, Tony Pinelli, Evo Ramos, and many others, we could just kind of list them off here, blended traditional genre and political lyrics to proclaim anti-imperialist sentiments, promote socialism, stand against social injustices, and importantly, to document their life experiences amidst the consolidation of the 1959 revolution. The Cuban Revolution did bring Latin America to the center of the Cold War, stoking fears of communist infiltration among US officials and Latin American elites, while providing some renewed hopes of socio-political change for others. Cuba's revolutionary government supported leftist struggle to consolidate, disseminate, and memorialize revolution throughout Latin America, thus establishing the island as a hub of transnational radical networks. Promptly, Fidel Castro's administration saw value in utilizing cultural expression as a political tool, and the Cuban government intentionally allied revolutionaries and musicians to harness a cultural movement that was already well in the making. So to give a little bit of perspective of what some of this looks like, I do want to share a variety of slides with us here that hopefully will help to put some of this perspective and provide a little bit of visual as well. But these are things that perhaps you are less familiar with. So when the Cuban Revolutionary Government hosted El Primer Encuentro de la Canción de Protesta, the first protest song meeting in 1967, and this is one of the posters and flyers of this meeting at Casa de las Americas in La Habana, Cuba. You had revolutionary musicians from around the world converging into Havana to record political songs, exchange musical and political ideas, offer each other mutual support, foster friendships. And at the time, many Nueva Canción artists attended the meeting of these musical revolutionaries and began to forge a close artistic and political relationship between Nueva Trova and Nueva Canción. The Cuban government would then go on to establish El Centro de Canción Protesta, the Center of Protest Music, at Casa de las Americas, which is House of the Americas. I realized I didn't offer an English translation of that a moment ago, in the late 1960s. And then it was in the year 1972 that El Movimiento de Nueva Trova was institutionalized by the Castro administration, making it a formally state-sponsored song movement. So later that year, Cuban trovadores, so these Trova musicians, also traveled to Santiago, Chile, making their international debut as musicians of the Cuban state's Movimiento de Nueva Trova, to perform at famous venues, including the Chilean National Stadium, where the Pinochet regime would later imprison thousands of suspected political opponents, killing dozens, including one of Nueva Canción's most famous musicians, who became kind of martyred by the movement, Victor Jara. And we'll talk about him a little bit more later as well. Following the September 11th, 1973 coup d'etat in Chile, when Augusto Pinochet's military regime repressed the Nueva Canción movement, and Chile entered its period of apagón cultural, or cultural blackout, the Cuban government offered refuge to many exiled Chilean leftist musicians, strengthening the ties between the Cuban and Chilean politicized cultural movements. So after going through hundreds of albums in the last few days here at FIU, I have selected a handful of songs and stories that I hope to share with you, but please know that each choice made to share something was also a choice to admit something. And it was a daunting task, but with that said, I have selected a few materials from the collection that I argue very clearly emphasize the Cold War solidarity between Cuban Nueva Trova and Nueva Canción Chilena. So when looking at hundreds of these things, right, Canción Protesta, this album that you see here on the screen, stood out as a profound sampling of the music and motivations of the Pan-American song movements, making it the first case study that we'll investigate this afternoon. This album is a compilation of songs from the protest song meeting hosted in Cuba during July of 1967. The historic event, as I mentioned, attracted musicians from all over the world, yet this album is going to include music by individuals from Cuba, Argentina, Chile, Peru, and Uruguay. These countries would continue to have foundational holds in what became known soon as a larger umbrella of Nueva Canción. So a little bit about the record label here. The LP that you see was recorded in Cuba in a variety of locations, Paradero, the Isle of Youth, and even at Radio Havana. And it was produced on vinyl by Paredon Records, which you can see there at the very tippy top. Paredon Records was founded in 1967 by American singer Barbara Dane and writer and editor Erwin Silber, who are pictured here, so you can have a face to a name. And after they made visits to the island in 1966, 1967, they were really motivated by these music movements and wanted to allow a way to record them. The couple, they both were activists here in the United States, and they devoted their label, Paredon, to producing international protest music. And so when they first traveled to Cuba, it was by invitation of Estela Bravo. So sorry that we're jumping around a little bit with some people, but it can be helpful to have an understanding of these connections, again, as that is so central to what I'm trying to uncover and really provide a book about. So a quick aside about Estela and her husband, Ernesto, is also pictured here. She is also American born. She's a filmmaker and at the time was a broadcaster at Radio Havana in the 60s. So she had invited Barbara Dane, who is a singer and associated with the American leftist folk music scene. to come to Havana to spend time there experiencing Nueva Trova. Bravo, she would become, pictured here, an important figure in the foundation of the Nueva Trova movement in conjunction with Casa de las Americas in the 70s, when it became an official institution of the Cuban state. So just a little background about who these individuals are, since they are not Cubans, they are indeed Americans. So the album Canción Protesta that was released in 1970 was part of a group release of Corazon's first 4 albums. So they released the 4 together, along with Angola, Victory is Certain, FDA Songs of the GI Resistance, and Hugh Newton's Speak. So these 4 were released as the first 4 of the record label. And the album includes music as well as spoken recordings from the leaders of the movement, such as the very first voice that you hear on the album, which is Fidel Castro's. So if we look back at the back of the album here on the right side, we can see all the artists from across Latin America who would actually become renowned for their contributions to these song movements. I've typed this out on the left. Sorry if it's still a little bit small. There's a lot of people to pack in there. But you can see the individuals from Cuba, Peru, Chile, Uruguay, Argentina, and then of course Cuba again. So Cuba is the beginning, kind of the bookends of this album on both side A and B. So what's really unique about this particular album is that it has a sneaky little record sleeve inside, a select pamphlet of quotations that Barbara Dane had gathered from interviews that she conducted with the musicians on the album, as they described the purpose and value of protest music. So I know that we don't have time to necessarily read them all, but I did just want to give a general overview of 3 of them. And Carlos Molina, we're going to look at a couple of his songs on the album. He notes that, as we have there on the top, that protest song must be more than a song of the professional artist. It must be the song of the people. The song must go beyond a small circle. The singer must learn to abandon his own personal interests, his selfishness. Otherwise, he will become a part of the bourgeoisie structure. Art is revolutionary, created not just for the individual. It can help to liberate man. The artist must be an artist of his class. So as I mentioned, this is one individual that for many that are a part of this experience are viewing their work as musicians in a very particular way. We don't have time to listen to the whole album, so I just pulled a couple of songs. And again, these lyrics, Barbara Dane translated them into English, included in that pamphlet. So also a gem, here's Carlos Puebla on the right. But I did at least want to go through a small selection. So this first song here, Diez Serán, We Will Get the 10 Million Tons, discusses the Castro administration's plan for the 10 million ton sugar harvest in hopes of revitalizing the Cuban economy after the revolution. So again, we see this kind of documentation of life in the consolidation of the revolution in '59. Next is a song, David and Goliath. This is, again, these are all 3 by Carlos Puebla. It was written in solidarity with the North Vietnamese army under Ho Chi Minh, as well as against quote unquote Yankee imperialism. So the United States having this sort of informal economic imperialism and political influence throughout what was labeled during the time of the Cold War as the Third World. The religious symbolism here is far from subtle, right? So comparing Vietnam and or Cuba to David in the dynamic, and the United States to Goliath. So this small, seemingly individual that seemingly would not win in a fight, being able to stand up against a larger, stronger entity. And then the third, Hasta Siempre, also Carlos Puebla, was written as a song for revolutionary leader Ernesto Che Guevara, who is Argentinian, yet very intimately involved in the progression of the Cuban Revolution before he left the island to continue fighting for revolution in other parts of the world, Latin America, as well as the continent of Africa. So this album, it is truly important as a source in understanding the Chilean-Cuban connection, as well as these transnational networks in the Americas. And it shows Fidel Castro's support for the pan-Latin American Nueva Trova and Nueva Canción song movements, demonstrating international solidarity in the production of protest music among the radical left musicians came to Cuba. Our second case study that we'll take a look at is by Grupo de Experimentación Sonora de ICAIC. This was part of Cuba's music industry that was nationalized in 1961. And then in 64, the National Record Label of Cuba, IGREM, which you can see there in the back of the album, bottom right-hand corner. So short for Empresa de Grabaciones de Ediciones Musicales, or Enterprise of Recording and Musical Editions, was founded in Havana. And until the year 1996, IGREM distributed music from its Havana recording studios under the name Areito. So some of the other music that we may see during this time comes from the Areito kind of label under that IGREM umbrella. IGREM actually continues to function, kind of an interesting note, and has since 2016 had its music distributed via Sony Music. So you may still be able to hear some of this music, even if it's not political in nature, coming out of Cuba. So as we're looking at this here, we're looking at one of the albums from El Grupo de Experimentación Sonora. It was founded in the year 1969 in conjunction with ICAIC. ICAIC was the sound experimentation group of the Cuban Institute of Cinematographic Art and Industry in Havana, and had several groups, individuals of famous founding members. The group would eventually disband in '76, but during the years active, they recorded many albums of their own, and most of them are simply numbered. So this is the fourth album, Cuatro, indicated by that number 4, again, bottom right hand on the back of the album. Released in '76, it was part of a series that they were putting together. And it is denoted by that 5-point star on both the front and back to be part of the official Nueva Trova stamp and movement. So this album, if you notice, it's remarkable and somewhat aggressive in its album artwork. So with our last case study, we thought a little bit more about production. With this one, we're thinking about presentation in terms of artwork. So as you can see on the front and back cover, photographed only in black and white, which is actually quite in contrast to Grupo's other very colorful album covers. But it is a photograph of a derivative of a Russian assault rifle set in front of a type of Stratocaster electric guitar. Interestingly, there is not any electric guitar on the album's recordings, but the electric guitar had by the 70s become a symbol of rock music associated with the counterculture movement. And then with the rifle pictured there, this kind of strength not only of Cuba, but also the Soviet Union. So the image is really eliciting this idea that music itself could act as a weapon of the Cold War revolution, combining counterculture beliefs for radical change, as well as the might of revolution and the backing of a power, a world power, such as the Soviet Union. So kind of an interesting juxtaposition. The third case is an album, El Consejo Nacional de Cultura, so the National Council of Cultural Heritage in Cuba. And the CNP is under the umbrella of the Ministry of Culture of Cuba and has been entrusted, that part of the ministry has been entrusted to protect, restore, exhibit, spread cultural heritage, not only in but Cuba, but throughout the world. This particular item, Jornada de Solidaridad con Lucha del Pueblo de Chile, or a day of solidarity with the struggle of the people of Chile, was produced in the Areito studios, I mentioned earlier, by the IGREM label. And it was a way of showing support for Chilean revolutionaries and activists after the September 11th coup d'etat, when Augusto Pinochet overthrew the popular unity government of President Salvador Allende, established a military junta that interrupted a lot of political and civilian activities, repressed organizing, really of any kind, and also commits that apagón cultural, cultural blackout that we discussed. So here, looking at the artwork, we're going to think a bit more of the sound, but also the presentation, since the artwork is quite striking. we see several Latin American revolutionary figures proudly illustrated together. So most prominently on the front and back is the face of Salvador Allende, who at the time was somewhat martyrized in this album, since there was speculations that he was murdered during the coup. This is a side note according to official announcements and court cases that even reappeared in the 2000s. It was declared officially as a suicide, closing the case. But at the time, this was a really transformative moment. And then, of course, standing behind him in support, you can see Simon Bolivar, Bernardo Higgins, Jose Marti, Che Guevara, and several others who acted as these revolutionary leaders in Latin American history. So we can see it positioning it this way. Not only is Cuba offering its support to Chile and to the popular unity government of Allende, but these leaders of the past are doing so as well. So I think we have a little bit of time to take a moment to listen to a few minutes of a song performed by Amelia Sanchez, excuse me, guitarra, or guitarra de Perjara, depending on kind of which album you're finding it on. So as a reminder from earlier, Perjara was one of the leaders of Chile's Nueva Canción movement, who was confirmed to be murdered by the Pinochet regime for his work as a political musician. And henceforth, he did act very much as a martyr of the political song movements. And so this was dedicated to him. I have provided the lyrics in Spanish on the left, since that is what you hear, but I am, again, aware that not everyone in the audience may feel comfortable with their Spanish or speak Spanish. So I've also provided translation of this on the right. So I'll let this play through, and then we'll have a quick little analysis of it all here. It's only about 2 minutes.
Guitarra, grito. Guitarra. Guitarra daga, guitarra historia. Guitarra de este y oeste, guitarra de norte y sur, guitarra blanca o violeta, guitarra.
Sorry about that. I don't know if you guys have volume, and the lights just went off in the conference room I'm in as well. One moment. Okay. All right, so I am sharing sound. It may be a bit quiet, so the recording itself, let me take a little pause, was done here at the collection. So it is possible that it might just be a little bit quiet. Let's see, is that as loud as it's going? And I did share volume, so if you're having trouble, you might be able to turn your personal computer volume up, and I can even mute myself for a moment.
Guitarra, grito. Guitarra. Guitarra daga, guitarra historia. Guitarra de este y oeste, guitarra de norte y sur, guitarra blanca o violeta, guitarra de miel o de sal. Guitarra. guitarra, guitarra antigua, guitarra joven, guitarra de la montaña, guitarra de la ciudad, guitarra de un solo canto, canta el idioma universal. Guitarra, ven, engrasa tus cuerdas, guitarras de la trinchera, guitarra, prepara tu canto, guitarra, mira a tu enemigo, apunta, no pierdas un tanto y dispara.
All right, thank you for your patience again. So sorry that you didn't have sound at first. So, you know, again, when selecting songs, this is an album that is definitely an important source of understanding the value of protest music, because we have Cuba's efforts to not only export the ideas of the 1959 revolution, but also to very directly support revolutionary music and countercultures that were springing up in other nations. But what this song also shows is a few things, right? We have the memory of Victor Jara, an individual that was ultimately murdered for the cause. We also have this discussion of la guitarra. So the guitar and the acoustic guitar specifically had a lot of function for the folk movements. It's very transportable. You can take it anywhere. You don't necessarily need any form of technology for it to be heard. And with that, right, it begins to be kind of quote unquote weaponized, as we saw in one of those earlier album covers, right, with the artwork juxtapositioning the rifle and the guitar itself. But what we see here as we have Sanchez working through her lyrics is that the guitar is almost immortalized, right? So it itself is crying out, expanding north, south, east, and west. Daga, right, acting as a weapon, mountains, city, right? We could kind of go through all of these together. And the ways in which at the end, right, it says in English, aim, don't skip a beat, and fire. So again, weaponizing the instrument itself as a way to fight the cultural Cold War. All right, so to close this afternoon, again, thank you so much for your time. These are case studies that do demonstrate the ways that music, its accessibility and its collectivity made it a powerful vehicle to circulate revolutionary ideas and build community. Unconstrained by state borders, musicians became leaders in the fight for revolutionary societies, transmitting these ideas. There's still much to come with this research. I look forward to not only returning to FIU and to Cuba, but other cities in Latin America and the United States as well, and being able to continue to expand and finalize the project in the years to come. So thank you all most sincerely for your time this afternoon. And I look forward to having a chat about some of your questions as well.
Thank you, Kimiko. And yeah, we'll open the floor for questions. I see somebody has already submitted one, and we'll wait for a few others to come. In the meantime, I have a couple of questions to start the conversation, Kimiko. Can you clarify the terminology that you were using, Canción Protesta, Nueva Trova, Nueva Canción? I know that you had yourself some trouble with the expression Canción Protesta because it's now used apparently in a different way than in the 1960s in Cuba.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, Dr. Duani, to fill everyone in, we were laughing about the first time I was in Havana and I was trying to do research and referred to something as Canción Protesta, talking about Nueva Trova, and in Cuba, it's not categorized that way. And so to give kind of an understanding, often música protesta or protest song or protest music was thought of enacting as an individual, a grassroots movement against often a government official organization. So, movements against imperialism or sexism, racism, et cetera, et cetera. With Nueva Trova, Nueva Canción, however, they are cultural movements of their own. So instead of thinking them as much of a musical genre, there are other things that are attached to it. So for instance, we have an album that I didn't include today from the collection, was taken from 20 years of Cuban film that was related to Nueva Trova and kind of compiling it. So with Nueva Canción, often the largest portion of Nueva Canción did come out of the country of Chile. But Nueva Canción as a movement did in time, or new songs spread throughout Latin America and even to Europe. So there are some albums that have been recorded in France, some that have been recorded in Spain. Spain has its own kind of new song movement. There are some individuals that will actually then set Nueva Trova under this large umbrella of new song. In my understandings at the moment, I kind of view Nueva Trova, Nueva Canción, and Música Protesta as separate though overlapping entities. So not necessarily like stacked one into the other, but ways in which they could coexist. So for that reason, right, this is kind of a way of thinking who maybe went where and how they were categorizing themselves. Part of why Trova, however, has often steered clear of a term like Música Protesta that was championed by a lot of Nueva Canción artists was that relationship with the government. So I don't want to contribute to a narrative of Cuban exceptionalism to say it was completely separate or different. However, with Nueva Trova, it is interesting in the fact that it was documenting the revolutionary life. So there are love songs that are part of Trova. The ones that we looked at today were more forwardly political, but you have songs about love, about children, about birds outside that are not necessarily specifically related to revolutionary ideas, but they're still documenting the experience. So that's how I would kind of briefly kind of categorize those.
Okay. If I can follow up on the term Nueva Trova, that implies that there's already another Trova, right? An old Trova. Yes. And I know that that is a part of the discussion in this field. So can you say something about the tradition of Trova in Cuba and I guess in the rest of Latin America? And I'm also particularly interested in the movement known as feeling because it's been associated particularly with Pablo Milanés.
Absolutely. Yeah. So Trova was the initial genre that gained popularity in the 30s, 40s, and 50s in Cuba. So, if we're looking at the period between movement for independence and Cuban Revolution of 59, it's kind of the second half of those 30 years that it really was championed. And so this Trova, or now Viejo Trova, Old Trova, that's been renamed, was a music that was foundational in guitar. And that's actually more of how I was introduced to it. I studied classical guitar in undergrad, so Trova music was part of what was on the agenda for that. So where that shift then occurs, moving into Nueva Trova, has often been this association with an international counterculture movement. So as I mentioned, it doesn't mean that everything was only political. It was documenting the experience of the revolutionary life. However, there is that moment in which they were taking an older form of music that was considered very Cuban and moving forward with that. What's interesting though, kind of comparing old Trova and new Trova, is some of the musical influences themselves. So for instance, there are several Nueva Trova albums that have pulled from instrumentation, for instance, from Chile. So you'll have like different wind flutes that are included, so that are not native, so to speak, quote unquote, to the island of Cuba. You also have Afro-Cuban music, rhythms, instrumentation, percussion that has been integrated into Nueva Trova. Again, this kind of push for change, for racial equality that was not included in Viejo Trova. So there's a shift not only in discussion, but also the way that the music was played. So, if for those that are maybe more comfortable with the American folk music movement and revival, there's like this pulling of musics from the past, so to speak, but revamping them and providing something new with a different story to say for the time.
Can you say something about feeling? El feeling?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So this idea of feeling with Pablo Milanés, I would agree, is kind of champion for doing this. He is an Afro-Cuban artist. And again, I kind of chuckle when I think about this because feeling as a movement has often been that was slightly less associated with the political. And so again, thinking about where all these circles, if I had a whiteboard, we could draw them out and place them. But a movement within Nueva Trova that was more associated, with these love songs, with these moments of life, of having the chance to feel and to live fully. And so the lyrics are often quite different. But we also see, again, a slight difference in instrumentation, where for some of these albums that are Nueva Trova produced and backed by IGREM and the Cuban government, they have a more international instrumentation to provide one description. You also had a lot of vocal recordings of interviews, such as the album with Fidel Castro, kind of introducing it. But feeling was, as good feeling on the inside as it could be. So it was providing kind of the other side of the coin for that experience.
Okay. This is my last question before we turn to the audience. Can you say a few words about the relationship between the Cuban government support of Nueva Trova on the one hand and the official condemnation of rock music? And then also to complicate matters, it appears from your talk that actually Nueva Trova did incorporate some elements of rock, pop, and folk music.
Yeah, this is always, I'm smiling because this is always getting exciting since there is overlap, with so many of these other areas that I hope to continue to study. We were talking when we got coffee, Professor Duani, I would love to have like a huge anthology at some point of countercultures in Latin America 30 or 40 years from now. But thinking specifically about this concept of rock music. So a lot of the ostracization of rock music, not only in Cuba, but other Latin American countries as well. This happened also in Argentina, in Brazil. This understanding that rock was very American and thus part of an imperial power in some way. And so with the folk music push, it was this effort to retain national identity and understanding of the roots of that place. So for instance, and this goes beyond the music to even the record labels. Areito is a Taino word. The Taino are the indigenous people of the island of Cuba. And it's related to an indigenous ceremony. And so from recording to sound, this was the push. So with rock music, right, on an international scale, it was this understanding of kind of stick it to the man, this counterculture understanding. But when the counter is the United States, that becomes very complicated. What is intriguing about this, though, is that you do see musicians, there's some old photos of like Silvio, for instance, and he's in a pair of blue jeans. Those went under a similar, right, discussion of, well, this type of clothing is very American. So how are you dressing yourselves? A group like Cuba-Chilean from Chile, more and more traditional indigenous clothing. So trying to keep that distance. So sorry that I went off on a little bit of a tangent, but thinking about rock music and that complication, that's kind of where it would sit.
Okay, great, thank you. So let's turn to some of the questions on the Q&A. We have a couple from Gene Rosenberg about Chileans in Cuba. And he wants to know first if these exiled Chileans in Cuba returned to Chile after the Pinochet regime. And then secondly, did La Nueva Canción survive inside Chile under the Pinochet regime?
Those are awesome questions. Thank you so much for sharing and for asking. Yes and no. there are parts to this, right? As we're going through it. So just like with any diaspora movement, there are some that wish to repatriate, that want to return home, and that feels like home. However, there are many that, with that movement and kind of dissemination, they become comfortable in this new place. And so with that in mind, there were Chileans and musicians that did return to Chile. There were also even Cubans that, once this settled down, emigrated from the island of Cuba to Chile, that were associated with some of these Nueva Canción movements. However, what we also see is the diaspora community remain quite strong. So for example, in Berkeley, Oakland, California, Northern California, just outside of San Francisco, La Pena, which is a Chilean cultural center, was renamed for La Pena in Santiago, Chile. That was founded by the Para siblings. And there was a large group of Chileans that left, moved to California, reestablished it, housed a lot of this music, still continue to play and enjoy Canción. Same thing with France, for example. There's a large movement of Chilean artists of France, several albums that were produced by French recording companies and then disseminated. And some of those people stayed. And then you also see some of these individuals that are the children of those migrants. So, for example, popular Chilean French artist Ana Trujillo, her family moved from Chile to France. She acts as a political activist contemporarily, so you can pull her up on Spotify, and she even sings and raps in both Spanish and French with this very interesting mix of Latin and European sound. So you can see these moments in which there are communities kind of spaced out. In terms of what survived during that time period, you know, music is something that I find so fascinating, that it's kind of built this universal language of mankind, but it offers a very interesting way of remembering. You know, even as a little kid, you can hum and sing songs in your head. So even if not publicly, these things are being produced anymore, a lot of that culture didn't go away. It was still very much a part of the Chilean population, and resurged. So now, post regime, one of the largest archives of Nueva Canción music, recordings, etc., is housed in Santiago at one of the universities. So this has kind of had this resurgence since then.
Okay. We have now one of the questions is actually long, by Christina Wirtz, and she wants to know more about the folk aspect of the musical tradition in Cuba, especially given the traditional linking of folklore to Afro-Cuban traditions. So let's see, I'm trying to summarize. I don't know if you can see that question there, but she wants to know what folk genres were Nueva Canción and Nueva Trova singer-songwriters drawing on in Cuba, and especially given the fact that folklore tends to be associated with Afro-Cuban music.
Yes, thank you so much. So in terms of the types of folk music, this is like, now I have to go back to like a whole story on colonial history. You know, as we were talking about earlier, la guitarra, the guitar, becomes a very, very central instrument, for example. That is not indigenous to the Americas. The guitar is an instrument out of the Mediterranean, especially Spain and Italy, that kind of championed this 6-string instrument. I mean, it has since had other derivatives here in the Americas. However, that becomes very fundamental, right? So it's kind of odd that you have this turning to indigenous or Afro-Cuban or local colloquial traditions, and yet the central instrument being used is European. So what we're seeing is a very interesting mix of what became Latin America as we know it, and even at the time. So some of the folk aspects, so especially in Cuba, thinking about Afro-Cuban traditions, come up in instrumentation. So for instance, like what type of percussion is being used, the rhythms that are being used, and the African diaspora throughout the Caribbean, rhythm is something that has been very, very fundamental. So I'm thinking about, you know, like rumba, for example. There's every Sunday in Havana, there's a huge group that still goes and dances rumba in its full entirety, costume and all. And so there is this pulling. in Chile, the history is a bit different. So Chile was on, instead of in the Caribbean, which did have more connections to the transatlantic slave trade, to other places throughout the Caribbean, as well as South America, the west coast of Africa. So that is filtering in, right? In Chile, it's in the Andes. So some of this folklore in the genres of something like Nueva Canción is coming from many of the Andean communities. There is an album whose title is now escaping me, that is associated with the province of Ayacucho, which is in Peru, actually, but drawing on, whether it's song lyrics that are not only in Spanish, but in Quechua, to instrumentation. So there's this mixing, but as you mentioned, I'm looking at the question has folk in quotes. I think that's very appropriate because it does ask this question of what is folk music. And even the guitar in Europe, goes back to this kind of more colonial period. So we see this mixing in the sound. So I hope that that's looking a little bit more clear.
Yeah, and I would also sort of add a comment on this because in many ways there seems to be some disconnect between Andean music in Chile and Afro-Cuban music in the Caribbean, and the fact that they do sound very different and come from different sources. So the fact that the Cuban government decided to sponsor this particular type of music, guitar music, etc., music to be heard rather than to be danced to, probably created some issues during the 1960s and 70s.
Absolutely.
Going on to another. Yeah.
I'll say, and just to add on to that, it's interesting to consider, which is part of what I hope to conclude more of my dissertation with, but continue to look at, is that there's different ways that we can interpret cultural production, such as music. So one is like, what does it mean? Like, let's look at the song lyrics. How does it make you feel? Do you want to move? Do you want to listen and watch? But the other is its function. So like, how did it function in the time in which it was created? How did it function in the watershed moments following? And then in moments like now, 60 years later, how is it acting as a process of memory? And so looking at those two as well can also help us investigate some of these questions about the folk aspect of these movements.
Okay. Another question by Christina Wirtz has to do with the contrast between recordings and live performances and tours. So can you say something about this latter process and how these tours might have contributed to transnational connections among the music performers themselves?
Absolutely. It's interesting because there are actually a lot of albums that are recorded live. Those just happen to not be the ones that I shared, and especially for the audio, I wanted something as clear as possible, so it was done in a studio. But there are a lot of albums that are recorded live and basically just run straight through with applause and cheering and discussions and introductions and all. The dissemination aspect, though, right? I kind of think of in various phases. So first, this sort of initial influence. So whether that is turning to roots, indigenous Andean communities, those of Afro-Cuba, indigenous Cuba, mixing that with sounds of the counterculture, such as the guitar and the blue jeans and the lyrics, but then having this interaction between them in the very early stages. So even from the get-go, these are individuals that are politically active, are wanting to share their ideas and interact with others that are similarly minded. That next step has often been kind of veering off into, right, a live performance locally or in small moments like the protest song meeting in July of '67, or recording. Right, and that becomes one of the large recording houses and locations for a lot of this music. Much of it was then reproduced coming out of New York. So I noticed the comment about New York City, so we can talk about that as well. So coming out of New York, as well as Mexico City, for example. So with the movements, they were more than just the music. So these song festivals, these cultural experiences were absolutely fundamental in the way that the music progressed. And so even aside from the recordings and what they sounded like, that experience was key. And music is a really interesting art form, because unlike something that is written or that is visual, when it is performed in real time, there is this interaction between musician and audience. So for instance, like, we're all sitting here together, and then suddenly like Dr. Dwani, if you picked up a guitar, we are now your audience listening, and then you set it down and we're all sitting here in a Zoom room again. And so there's this construction even of space that can change. So in time, right, these song movements become larger, recordings continue to spread, and that allows these individuals to interact. You're hearing music, you want to meet that person, you're able to travel, but the song movements provided a place for audience to actually interact with each other and not just the musicians, making it really unique. Now, like I said, a lot of this music is even on things like Spotify, so that transnational nature of it continues, where this music is pretty widely available.
Thank you. I don't know if you want to expand on the role of New York City and the diffusion of these movements.
Sure, yeah, since we touched on it a little bit. So for instance, the Paredon Records, it was established in Brooklyn. There's also a Cuban Cultural Center in New York City that is important. Revolutionary Jose Marti, back from independence in the late 1800s, much of his organizing happened in New York and in Key West. So there was still this sort of connection there. What is unique, though, I think, is not only what is happening from a Cuban perspective, but actually the connections between the transnational left of Cuba and the United States. So there are some albums that were recorded in Cuba, but then released by recording companies in New York that were written for individuals such as Angela Davis, who is an American and wanting to kind of share her ideas. And so there is this very interesting connection. However, with that being said, what we do miss is some of the travel. That happens less. By the 70s, when some things calm down, there are a handful of musicians that travel to New York and record an album at the Cuban Cultural Center there in New York City. But this is one of the only ones that I've found. So like I may be missing some that are in there, but New York does have a role, but due to the political relationship between Cuba and the United States, more of it almost came from afar, if that makes sense.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, also it was very difficult for musicians or artists to travel to the US anyway.
Yes.
Until much later, probably the 80s.
Yeah, because in the 80s is when the group such as Buena Vista Social Club had a US tour, and it was a huge deal. You know, now they still perform in Havana weekly. But that was this moment where that really happened. But before then, travel was extremely difficult.
Okay. So we have two final questions on our Q&A, and I think we're going to have to end with this for lack of time. They sort of bring you up to the present. First one is by Gabriela Rivero, and she wants to know about your thoughts about the movement Patria y Vida, the rap song that is very popular for the last couple of years. And I guess the question is, how does that compare to Nueva Trova in terms of the level of attention from the Cuban people? And I understand this would also include Cuban people here in the US.
Yeah, this is interesting. Thinking about, especially being situated here in South Florida, there are very many different experiences, as I mentioned earlier, with the revolution, right? This looked very, very different depending on where individuals sat politically, economically, socially, etc. And it wasn't the same for everyone. And so now thinking about some of these movements that are coming out, I feel like recent years, there has been this push in the United States for other forms of quote unquote social or protest music. Like Childish Gambino is a rapper that comes to mind that is, has a few songs talking about social injustice in America. So like Patria y Vida, Country and Life, excuse me. Wanting to take a stand that is probably a little bit more comfortable with a lot of Cuban Americans who have felt as though they've been in exile from their home for generations. And so I think in terms of the level of attention, this is somewhat hard to assess in some ways, since I think Patria y Vida is somewhat newer. You know, we have things like social media now, so things can spread. However, we also live in a world of, you know, like clickbait titles, so things come and go in a much different way. Nueva Trova and Nueva Canción, we see a lot of songs that even artists reproduce of each other's and remake and change instrumentation, though the lyrics or the chord progressions may stay the same. I will definitely be curious, you know, my anthropologist side is like really intrigued to see. I had done research in the past. The first time I came to the Dialectic collection here at FIU to look at some of these reactions to the revolution through music in the 60s here in Miami. You know, there's a lot of kind of stand-up comedy and albums that are very aggressive. There was an album that even came out of the UK titled Death to Fidel. So there have been a variety of things that have gained momentum over the decades. So I know that's not necessarily quite as directed at Patria Vida, but I think, you know, time will tell kind of its place in historical record and the impact. But I do think that on a local level, it is a way for individuals to want to stand in solidarity for the way that they envision their country. And what Cubanidad or like Cubanness means. That means different things. So I think in that sense, it acts as a very, has a very similar function, right? Thinking about function versus meaning, and that being closely connected.
Okay, yeah. So our final question is from Jean Rosenberg again on a very contemporary topic. What is the status of Nueva Canción in Chile after the election of the new president, Gabriel Boric?
That is a good question. I feel like I would have a harder time speaking to that, simply because most of what I have looked at and feel comfortable speaking to with Nueva Canción exists in like the 60s and 70s. And this is a much more recent event in which, like I said, if I'm being frank, more of the recent events that I look at have been Cuban in nature just as of late. But that's something that I would definitely like to look into. So I am more than happy, you know, I don't know if you'll have access to my email, but I know we can't go through all the questions. So if you have follow-ups, that's something that I am intrigued at looking at. And I just haven't had a chance to consider what it looks like in the present moment. But I have relationships with several professors and academics in the city of Santiago that are still studying La Canción, that are still enjoying it in the universities. But that's also within a very specific cultural context within the academic world. So I don't want to make a statement about the country as a whole. But absolutely feel free to email me. My email address, for those of you that don't have it, is on the UC San Diego History Department page. I'm listed as one of their graduate students. If you click the little photo of my face, it'll pop up. So if you want to send me like a little reminder, I'm more than happy to look into it. We can correspond that way.
Yeah, and I guess we'll end on a final comment by Jorge Eduardo Yi, who actually comments that the most popular song associated with the recent protests in Cuba was Los Prisioneros, El Baile de los que Sobran. And he wonders if songs by Victor Jara or Violeta Parra are no longer that popular with the younger Chilean generation.
I do think that there's a bit of a change, right? And even considering like politically how things have changed, the types of changes that individuals are pushing for doesn't look the same 50, 60 years later. However, though, right, even if it might be losing its political influence, like that might be shifting. I do think it still stands very strong of the way that Nueva Canción has now become this kind of pride of Chilean heritage or understanding, whether that's the case for you or not, if any of you here are Chilean. But I think kind of on a national level, we see a lot of that, especially after the Pinochet regime. So for current generations, of course, that can change. And I think each generation has its own experiences. You know, we've been living in a global pandemic the last 2 years with crazy changes politically, economically, socially, et cetera. And so what people are going to connect to and what they're going to want to have change in the world is going to be different. Yeah.
So thank you, Kimiko, for sharing your thoughts with us and with the audience. And thank you to the audience for joining today. We'll conclude our event today, but reminding you that we still have some events coming up next week by another Ayala Library Travel Grant awardee. So thank you again, and good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you so much for having me. This is truly a pleasure and enjoy hearing from all of you.